Christian homes, homes where the Father is true and strong, homes that are free from the blight of wrong, homes that are joyous with love and song. God give us Christian homes. God give us Christian homes.
There's a professor of gerontology at Cornell University named Karl Pillemer. And several years ago, Karl Pillemer was about to turn 50 years old. And so Dr. Pillemer thought to himself, I need to aggregate as much wisdom as I can from those people who are older than me so I can figure out if there's any secrets to life, if I can figure out if there's any secrets to living, any ways I can live better, because as I advance into the second half of my life, I need to make sure that I'm utilizing every moment properly. And so what Dr. Pillemer did was he aggregated all the different, he interviewed several people that were in their upper years of life, and I'm talking anyone from the age of 51, which he was turning 50, anyone from 51 on. I'm not to say that you're in the upper years of life by any stretch, but 51 on up, to see if there was any wisdom that some of these people who had lived longer than others could tell them about life, how to live, what about their career, maybe about just general happiness. And he aggregated all these findings into a book called 30 Lessons for Living. And this book spans every different type of thing you can imagine. It talks about, like I said, your career, your hobbies, your family life, your health, your personal health, those are different things. But one of the things that caught my eye was what he had to say about marriage. And he especially focused in on people that had been married for 50, 60, 70 plus years. I think he even interviewed one couple who had been married almost 80 years. And as he began to aggregate all these different findings and talk to the different people, he began to notice one trend specifically within all these different people that had been married for 50 or 60 years plus. And the primary one for all of those was work. All of these people viewed marriage as being some type of an investment. They viewed it as something that once they entered into, they never left unless there was some kind of extenuating circumstance. But they never entered into it with the idea that anything would ever change that. As a matter of fact, at one point he made this observation about all these people. He said, if you are entering into a permanent relationship based on the intention of change, and that to me is the primary phrase, if you are entering into a permanent relationship based on the intention of change, you are on the right or the wrong track. Let me make that very clear. You're on the wrong track if you enter into it with the intention of change. And this idea of actually entering into marriage with the intention of it being for life, something that you work towards, something that you put your heart and your mind and your soul invested in, is something that other people have studied. There's one person that has done extensive research in the idea of arranged marriages specifically within the nation of India. India has a very patriarchal system. It's kind of changed over the last 50, 100 years. But has a system known as arranged marriages, where the parents will choose the bride and the spouses for their kids based on a bevy of criteria. And that criteria can change from person to person. It is worth mentioning as well that within the last 50 or 100 years, these people that are about to enter into these arranged marriages have the options to nix any one of those options if they would like to. Most don't because they trust their parents' insight. But the divorce rate amongst people within India, I thought this was astounding, over the last 50 to 100 years, stems anywhere from a very conservative to a very, very liberal rate of 1 to 7%. And in case you're wondering, this rate also is about the same for people who claim to be satisfied within their marriage. Just in case you're wondering if this is some kind of legal system where people can divorce because there's going to be legal ramifications, those same people who talked about how arranged marriages or who were in arranged marriages never divorced, hardly ever. And 7% was at the very, very top end of all the studies that I saw. Most dealt with that 1%. Even those people recorded that they were very satisfied within their marriage, that they didn't want to go elsewhere, they didn't have any desire to divorce. Dr. Rober, who was a Harvard professor who studied this idea and kind of a lot, he had this observation about this. He said, in the West, marriages are easy to get out of. But in arranged marriages, the commitment is very strong. They get married knowing they won't leave. And so when times are harder, if they face injury or trauma, they don't run away. It brings them closer. I like what these people have had to say about the idea of marriage, because what these people are in essence saying in marriage is, if you enter into this lifetime contract, this covenant between two people, you enter it noticing those vows that you make on your wedding day, you enter it knowing that you're not going to leave, or at least with the intention that you're not going to leave. In today's world, for whatever reason, you have people that will say, well, I'm going to marry this person, and if it doesn't work out, which that's a very fluid concept, but if it doesn't work out, then I'll just leave and I'll go somewhere else. Now, this does not dictate, by the way, the extenuating circumstances, things that we're going to discuss this morning in the sermon. But when we talk about at large the rate of divorce that people have, it's viewed very flimsy. And the one thing that all these people had in common, those people who have been married, whether you're talking about arranged marriages or people who have been married 80 years plus, all of them went into it with the idea and with the commitment that they would not run away. And I love that concept. And especially what he mentions there at the end, when it says that those trials, those trauma, those injuries, the things that these people go through, it brings them closer rather than tears them apart. I have been married all of 4.5 years. I made sure I memorized that this morning before I came, just because I know Melina would bust me if I didn't. I've been married almost 5 years, and I haven't seen the amount of trauma that some people have gone through in their marriages. I know that there are people I'm speaking to here this morning who have been through situations within their marriage that have been life-altering, that have been extenuating beyond the scope of what I would consider human reasonability. I can't fathom going through things like that. And overarching, what I see amongst those people who have gone through those things, is not this desire to be torn apart, where I'm not going to stand you because you did this to me, but we're going to get through this as a team. We are going to approach life together. And may I say on top of this, that this is the way it should have been from the beginning. This is the way it should have been from the beginning. And that's going to be a central theme that we'll repeat throughout the course of this lesson. Those of you who have been with us the entire year know that we're in the middle of this yearly theme. We planned this 11 months ago. We've touched on various subjects, baptism, Bible classes, male leadership most recently. But we've also, this morning, going to talk about the idea of marriage and divorce. And to this one point, we're going to talk about what the Bible says about marriage and divorce. And on this one point, I will make this one very grand declaration. This next slide is in 287 font because I want to make sure that it's plain. God's plan for marriage is one man, that's very important in today's culture, by the way, one man, one woman for life. That's the plan. Now, we can talk about extenuating circumstances. We're going to, because we have about another 45 or 50 minutes with which to talk. I didn't get a groan, so that's a good sign. That's the plan. We're going to talk about the extenuating circumstances. But at large, that's the idea for marriage. And for whatever reason in today's culture, people don't see it like this. People see it as you have this escape hatch, where I can say, well, if something goes wrong, I'll just pull that ripcord and I'll just get gone. Because after all, my own personal satisfaction and my own personal happiness is worth far more than whatever that person can bring to me. And people approach marriage with two different mindsets. One of which, as we already talked, with an idea of stability, I'm going to stay in it forever. But the other one is, if it doesn't work out, it's kind of like buying a car. If I don't really like Subaru, which I don't know if anybody does, if you like Subaru, great for you. I don't know you. But if you don't like your car, trade it in for a new one. Trade it in for a younger model. Trade in one for whatever you want. The idea is, when you make the commitment to marriage, you make it for life. That's the intention. This is the crux of everything that we talk about with Matthew 19. Flip over there if you would. You knew that we were going to start off with Matthew 19? Because it is the hotbed of all of these different discussions. And I want to make this point plain too as we talk about this idea of marriage and divorce, remarriage. I understand full and well that this is a very, very contentious issue, not only within the church, but also within society at large. I knew of one person who did a study amongst, and I'm going to qualify this very specifically, did a study amongst conservative churches of Christ in the South and Midwest. And what he uncovered was that there were anywhere from 50 to 60 different positions on marriage, divorce, remarriage, MDR for short. 50 to 60 different positions on marriage and divorce, remarriage. In retrospect, when we look at Matthew chapter 19, the Jews look tame by comparison. Because they have 2, maybe 3 dominant schools of thought. You have people that are talking in today's world about polygamy, divorce for any reason. You have people talking about all sorts of different things. And I'm not even bringing the homosexual debate into this nugget. I'm talking specifically between marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And you and I both know the reason that there are 50 to 65 different positions on marriage. It's because the situation always changes when it's you that's on the line. It always changes. That's where false doctrine comes into play. It always changes when it's you, when it's me. When I look at the scriptures and I say to myself, I'm in this position, I don't want to be in this position, I look to see what God says, and I see what God says about my position, I begin to think, maybe he didn't mean that. And I go back to the Greek and I abuse the Greek. I go into the Hebrew and I abuse the Hebrew. And then I look into the life of Jesus in the cultural context and I abuse all those elements together. And I say to myself, this is what he actually meant. And what actually means, what I actually think he means, is polar opposite than what Jesus meant. That's why I put that size 287 font, because that's the thing that we need to get plain. Barring any type of escape hatch or extenuating circumstances that people want to read into these sections, God's plan is clear. One man, one woman, for life. That's the idea. In Matthew chapter 19, the Pharisees had a bone to pick with Jesus. As with most questions that the Pharisees and Sadducees brought up towards Jesus, it wasn't designed necessarily to get an answer that they wanted from the Scriptures. They weren't asking him for his wisdom. They were most likely trying to trap him in something. And the reason for this in Matthew 19 is no different. The reason that they're bringing this question to him is to trap him for this reason. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 1. It says, when Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Now we're talking about the Transjordan region. Large crowd followed them, and he healed them there. So out in the country, away from these major metropolises, especially Jerusalem, in the Transjordan area, people are going miles to hear from him. Verse 3, the Pharisees came to Jesus, obviously from a long way. Most of them never really left Jerusalem, unless they had to. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Verse 4, he answered and said, have you not read that he created them from the beginning, made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is the first question. The first question that people bring up to Jesus, and there's going to be 3 questions in this section. The first question that people bring up to Jesus is it lawful to divorce or for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Now in today's world, especially third-wave feminism that's been happening within the last 30, 40 years, a lot of people look at this and say, this is a very male-centric question. I don't like the way that this is phrased because it puts the male in the position of authority, or he can do what he wants and the woman can't do what she wants. That's an abuse of the text. Because when you look at the Scriptures, and especially look at the tradition surrounding it, yes, men had the ability to divorce their spouse for any reason, especially under certain codes, but, not in the Bible, by the way, but under certain interpretations. But the women very oftentimes had the ability to force the man's hand. So it's not as male-centric as we sometimes think. The man can do whatever he wants, and a woman can never initiate any kind of proceedings like that, no matter what. A woman oftentimes would go to the judges, would go to the ruling priest to try and force the husband to divorce her, so that she could then go and divorce or go marry somebody else. It's very sticky when you start bringing divorce or remarriage into the situation. But the idea of this question very simply is, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? This is the question that's in play. And the major debate on this subject, I'm sorry that Ken's not here because this is his favorite phrase. The major debate on this subject goes back to 2 schools of thought. That's his favorite phrase. There's the Hillel phrase, or there's the Hillel school, and there's the Shammai school. And both of these schools of thought have very prominent followings, especially in first century Judaism, who are looking at this very question, or this question, very separately. Both of them take their precedence for this question back to Deuteronomy chapter 21. You can look at that if you want to, the first 4 verses. Both of them are taking this question back to Deuteronomy chapter 21. And the allocation or the allowance that Moses is giving in Deuteronomy chapter 21 for this certificate of divorce is hinged on the phrase, if you find anything unpleasing in her. That's the phrase that they're hinging on. So when they say in this instance, can a man divorce his wife for any reason, they're not really talking for any reason. They're talking about the position of any unseemly thing. Now to me, when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 21, the context is very clear that what he's talking about is this idea of sexual immorality. That I've found that you have committed sexual immorality in the past of some kind that's displeasing to me. Virginity was a very highly prized attribute by God. And that's the reason that he mentions that. But the 2 schools of thought imbued that idea of things that were unpleasing and things that were unsatisfactory to you in 2 different ways. And one person, one school, viewed that as being sexual immorality. That you have cheated on me, that you were not virgin, something along those lines. And so because of that, I'm now going to leave you. That's the unseemly thing. But there was another school of thought that viewed that unpleasing, unsatisfactory thing as being basically anything else. If your wife burns the toast, that is unpleasing to me. Never mind the fact that she made you breakfast in the first place. But if you burn the toast, if my orange juice is past the expiration date, I like the pendant on it, we're going back and forth. But if you burn my toast, if the expiration date of the orange juice is past the day, that's displeasing to me, it's ruined my entire day, and I can divorce you as a result. And so what you have in this early century, this first century Judaism, is these 2 dominant schools of thought. Or somebody would say, well, it has to be for the reason of sexual immorality. There has to be an affair that takes place. That's the very strictest definition. And the other school of thought is, well, if there's any unseemly thing, if you just don't like her for whatever reason, maybe she just, I don't know, I'm trying really hard not to use any example that people won't delineate back to me in this relationship. Let's just go to the toast thing, because that seems to work out so far. If you burn the toast, then I can just leave you for whatever reason. That's the very liberal definition of it. And so what these people are asking Jesus with this question was, which school do you fall under? Because there is a dominant group of Jews that believe this, there's a dominant group of Jews that believe that, and which school do you fall under? May I also throw in this as well, that this debate is still raging today. This question, when you look at Matthew chapter 19, is not settled on a lot of people's minds. Because a lot of people look at Matthew chapter 19 and say, well, Jesus never answered the question. And because of that, they put themselves firmly in one school of thought which says, I can divorce my wife for any reason. This is where we get into the idea of divorce for the kingdom of God's sake, divorce for whatever. She's making me not a good Christian, and so because of that, I'm going to go divorce her and marry somebody else. That's also an abuse of the text. That's also wrong. And yet people still fall under that vein as well. But the one thing I want us to point out when we look at this section of Matthew chapter 19 is that when they pose this question to Jesus, Jesus does not answer that. Did you notice that? When Jesus responds back to this question, Jesus never at any point says, I am firmly with Hillel, and I agree with Hillel. He could have very easily said that. Or he could have said, I am very much with Shammai. I'm of one of these two schools of thoughts. But Jesus doesn't do that. Because what Jesus does in talking about Matthew chapter 19 is not take it back to two dominant Jewish teachers. He takes it all the way back to creation and says, at the very beginning, God created them male and female. That's the way it should have been. One man, one woman, for life. That brings up the second question, which is, this is where they're trying to get Jesus at odds with Moses, why then did Moses command that people would give her a certificate of divorce and then send her away? If you agree with the creation account, you're going to bring that in the fold. Then why did Moses do that? Because either Moses is wrong or you're wrong. And notice what Jesus also says in the back of that. Jesus says very specifically in this instance that it wasn't because of the law. Moses didn't want to allow that. He allowed that because, and here's the key phrase, because of the hardness of your heart. The one thing that gets overlooked in this entire discussion of marriage, divorce, remarriage, especially in the 21st century, is that women that were divorced in the very first century, especially in Jewish times, were at a very much of a loss in terms of their social impact. You can see the story of Ruth, you can see the story of Naomi, and you can see just how much not having a husband impacts you socially and financially. And so the reason, in large part, at least in my opinion, why Moses, on top of this, kind of extrapolating this idea of the hardest of the heart is, men were divorcing their wives anyways. But there has to be some kind of legality to the whole situation in order to protect the woman. The idea here fundamentally is, God never wanted divorce to happen. But He allowed it because the Jews in that day were so immoral that they were just going to do it anyways. And that's more or less what Jesus is alluding to here in this passage. And this is, I think, something that we need to grapple with when we talk about this subject. We're going to discuss this more here in a second. But when we talk about this subject about marriage, divorce, remarriage, especially within this, if you hear nothing else in the next 20 seconds, listen to this. Like how I phrase that? There is always sin in divorce. There is always a sin in divorce somewhere. And I want to make that plain. Because oftentimes what we do, and especially, we're going to talk about Matthew 19 with the exception here in a second, but when we look at that situation of somebody has committed an affair and they're gone, the divorce or the sin is very obvious. But especially when you look at the situation of divorce for the kingdom of heaven's sake, or you look at divorce because you just don't like her, the question of who sinned becomes very muddy in that instance. And the question that we sometimes come is, who is at fault? Who's the problem here? Who instigated this whole thing? And I will tell you right now, that even in the situations where somebody has committed an affair, the innocent party isn't always innocent. Now I know what I'm going to say, what I said is probably heresy. And I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that if you are scripturally divorced and scripturally married, that you are in sin anyway. That's not what I'm alluding to. But sometimes when we look at the innocent party and the guilty party, we think the innocent party is 100% innocent, the guilty party is 100% guilty. I don't know everyone's situation. I don't know what percentage that is. You may be fine, that's great. But there may be situations when we're talking about here where the man pushes the woman to leave. Now, he's not responsible for her affair. He's not responsible for the fact that she committed adultery. But what if every time she comes home at night, he treats her like garbage? What if every time he comes home, he's always talking about other women? He may not do anything, but could he drive her away? And this is in large part what Jesus was talking about. Look at Malachi, the 2nd chapter. Put your finger in Matthew chapter 19. What I'm not saying in this instance, like I mentioned, I know that I'm talking to people right now who are scripturally divorced and scripturally married. I am not speaking to you. What I'm speaking to is this mentality overall where the innocent party is always 100% innocent. That's not always the case. In Malachi chapter 2, listen to this. In Malachi chapter 2, starting in verse 13, he says in this passage, and this is, the prophets oftentimes have rebukes about the people over and over and over again. But in Malachi chapter 2, starting in verse 13, it says, this is another thing that you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, with groaning, because He no longer regards the offering or accepts from favor with your hand, or from your hand. Yet, verse 14, you say, why are you not accept this sacrifice? Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously. Though she is your companion and your wife by covenant, he's attacking the husbands in this instance. And by the way, I know that situation can be flipped. The same applies either way. Verse 15, but not one who has done so is a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly office? Our offspring. Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce, verse 16, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. The person who had an affair, the person who committed adultery, the person who gave the other party the legal right to divorce, that person is going to be held accountable, if for no other reason than he mentions it in that passage. Malachi chapter 2 is very plain. I hate divorce. But notice what he also says. I also hate the one who covers his garment with wrongs. The one who treats the wife of your youth as something that you can spit upon, as something that you can disrespect, as something that you can literally drive away as hard as possible until eventually they leave. Or they commit adultery, and then you can remarry, which is even better, of course. It's what they want in the first place. And what he's arguing for in Matthew chapter 19 and in Malachi chapter 2 is this harmonious marriage relationship where each person seeks the benefit of the other. Now, if one person has an affair, commits adultery, they have the right, according to Matthew chapter 19, to divorce and to remarry. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not attacking that. But we need to realize that there needs to be a relationship there in the first place. That these two people need to love. And just because a divorce has not happened does not mean that there's not sin in the marriage. If your marriage is crumbling, and if you hate your spouse, and if you turn against your spouse, and you tear her down, if you tear him down, if you spit on him, those are things that are wrong in the sight of God. And that needs to be repented of. And the argument that Jesus was bringing up in Matthew chapter 19 was the exact same thing in Malachi chapter 2, which is, you can't just have this blanket legal certificate and throw it away, and that's that. Because that's not the way it was intended in the first place. Matthew chapter 19 goes on and talks about this instance. It has the very well-known clause, and this is called, which I don't know what this is called. I think it's called the exemption clause. I'm way out of touch with what people call it these days, you kids and your music. But in Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 7, or starting in verse 9, he has this clause at the end. And he says, very honestly, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, marries another woman, commits adultery. And oftentimes what we do with this phrase is we exclude, or we harp on that middle section, except for immorality. And we think that that trumps everything. When in reality, the force of that passage, verse 9, is seen in what he says before and after that. When he says, anyone who divorces his wife commits adultery. Now, immorality is the exception. Sexual immorality is the clause. That's the exception clause. But if you divorce your wife and marry another, you have committed adultery. In today's world, that doesn't mean a whole lot. Where 50% of marriages end in divorce, that doesn't really seem to have a whole lot of effect. That I committed adultery. What does that mean? I'll tell you exactly what it meant in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the apostles. Because right after this, in verse 10 through 12, the apostles respond to this whole situation, starting in verse 10, by saying, the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. If this is the situation, if I am prone, or if I can fall under an adulterous relationship with my wife, and vis-a-vis a relationship with God, then it's better for me not to marry. They would rather be not married than to enter into a covenant where this was even remotely responsible. And that shows you the gravitas by this situation. Starting in verse 11, Jesus expounds on this. He says, not all men can accept this statement. I know that's what you're saying. Not all men can accept this, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. There are also eunuchs who make themselves eunuchs by the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He is able to accept this. Let him accept it. This is the situation. These are the three questions. This is what Jesus is teaching in this passage. And so when people try to talk about the idea of marriage, divorce, remarriage, they try to muddy it with all these yeah buts, or and ifs, or what nows. When in reality, the situation in Jesus' mind is very plain. One man, one woman, for a wife. And if we draw some conclusions out of this, because I know it's very easy to say those types of things, but there are three very quick, I can actually even go 50 minutes in case you're wondering. At least I don't think I am. But there are three very quick lessons that we can draw out of Matthew chapter 19. And the first is one that we've already made several times. The idea is marriage is to be intended for a wife. I've repeated this now 6 times. And it needs to be repeated 600 more. Because in our culture, and I don't know what the current statistics are, I've heard anywhere from 40 to 50% but 50%, let's argue that because that's the most common, 50% of marriages end in divorce. I think it's probably closer to 43, 44, 44.6, that's what we'll call it. 50% of marriages end in divorce. And in today's world, we view divorce. We view divorce as being this get out of jail free card where you can just play it like your Monopoly. You get out and keep doing your own thing. That's not the way it was intended from the beginning. And in a world where 50% of marriages end in divorce and 75% plus of second marriages end in divorce, and you don't want to go any higher than that, we need to be the exception, ladies and gentlemen. We need to be the exception and not let our faith be molded by culture and enter into a marriage covenant where we say, well, I know God says that it's for life, but everybody's cool with me if I divorce. It's not really that big of a deal. We need to be the exception. If the divorce statistics are 99% of marriages end in divorce, be the 1%. Hold fast to what God says because it's Him that says it and not somebody else, not culture, and not what your buddy down the street thinks. One thing we need to realize, and we need to rescue from the throes of our culture, is that there is a sanctity within marriage that is sacred to that bond. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I want you to look at this. There is a sanctity within marriage that is very specific and very special for that bond. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 has been taken in a whole lot of different ways, especially the first 11 verses. But the last several verses, 12 through 19, mean exactly what they think. So when you read this in 12 through 19 and you're thinking, what is it talking about? Your first impression is probably the right one. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting verse 12, he says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but I will not be mastered by anything. Verse 13, food is for the stomach is for food, but God will do away with both of them. Yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. That last phrase highlights everything he's about to say. Everything he already said, everything he's about to say. The body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. Verse 14, now God has not only raised the Lord, but will also raise us up through His power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? He says that rhetorically, because we should understand that. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May never be. Or do you not know, speaking very literally in this instance, that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says the two shall become one flesh. Flee, verse 17, but the one who joins, himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. Verse 18, flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you have been bought with the Christ. Therefore glorify God in your body. This is a very specific instance. And it's talking about the sanctity in marriage that does not exist in the culture around us. I grew up in Amarillo, Texas. Most of you know that. If you don't, I grew up in Amarillo, Texas. But the one very unfortunate designation that Amarillo High School has, at least in the time period that I was there, which was 2000 to 2004, is it was at one point the teen pregnancy capital of Texas. More women got pregnant in my high school, and I know of 3 off the top of my head that I was friends with that got pregnant and had to drop out of high school before they even finished. Teen pregnancy is rampant. Sexual immorality is rampant. And people, especially in today's world, want to say, well, it's this new phenomenon. It's something that, the youth of today, they're just so depraved. And by the way, I hate the phrase, the youth of today. I never really know if I fit into that. But people say the youth of today is so depraved, and they're just so much immoral than I used to be. Here's some facts to back that up. 3% in today's world abstain from premarital relations until marriage. That's in 2013. That number, if you want to go back to the 1950s, jumps to 11%. 11% of everybody in the 1950s abstained from sexual immorality until marriage. So in case you're sitting here thinking to yourself, today's generation is just so much more worse than they have been in the past, you don't have to look at Corinth. Go back 2,000 years, look at Corinth. See how immoral that culture was. People today that want to say, well, sexual immorality is just something that everybody should experiment with. And there are even schools who are not teaching abstinence. That are teaching that you should engage in those types of things in order to broaden your horizons. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And what we need to rescue about this thing specifically is the idea that it is intended to be within marriage, and it's intended to be within that very sanctimonious aspect for life, not experimented with. You can also say, in regards to this situation, and I think this is very important, that divorce or remarriage are allowed in the case of sexual immorality. I've said it a few times here this morning so far. You can see it from Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9. That sexual immorality is that 3-word exclusion of all of this situation. That if your spouse is cheating on you, if your spouse has sought somebody else, gone to be with somebody else, That's the instance within divorce and remarriage is acceptable. It's not the only one. Look at Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7, starting verse 1. This is the other exclusion. Or do you not know, brethren, this is, by the way, context is talking about the old and the new law. That's the context. Romans 7, starting verse 1. Or do you not know, brethren, from speaking to those who know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives? For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning her husband. Verse 3, so then if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. And that word meant a lot. It shouldn't mean a lot in today's world. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. You may look at this situation and say, well, there's other reasons for divorce or remarriage outside of sexual immorality. And you're right, death. If your spouse dies, probably I'm not advocating hiring a hitman, but if your spouse dies, that's when you can remarry. It's not really a divorce in that situation. But if your spouse is gone, you can remarry. And this is what people gravitate towards. They say, well, there has to be something else besides that. But the one verse that everyone goes to when we talk about this divorce, I can divorce as long as I don't remarry. That's the keystone that people have. In other words, that's saying, I would rather live alone than live with you. I can't think of a much worse thing to say to somebody. If I said that, Melina would probably kill me before I walked out the door. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, this is what everybody goes to. I'm really get in trouble on the way home. Anybody wants to eat lunch, let's eat as close as possible. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is the clause. This is what, and I know what people call this. This is what people call the Pauline exemption. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, this is the tool that everybody uses. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 10. There's two verses here that are very important to understanding this section. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11. He says, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. Verse 11, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. This is one of those situations in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, where people will gravitate towards one verse or the other. And what they'll say is, verse 11 trumps everything. Verse 10, don't divorce. But verse 11, if it does, this is what you do. And so what people do in this instance is they'll say, well, I'll commit this sin. I'll leave my spouse. I'll just remain unmarried. I'll go forward, give money, whatever repentance involves in that situation. But I would rather go through all of that very fabricated and fake repentance, which I'm not really sorry for, and live with that person for the rest of my life. And this is where people get into this idea of the divorce for any reason. Which, by the way, if this were the answer, if that were really the case, then in Matthew chapter 19, when the Pharisees asked Jesus, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? The answer would have been, sure. If verse 11 trumps verse 10, then that's the answer that would have been given. But there's two things about this passage that we need to focus on. Number one, very early in verse 10, he makes the mention that it's not him who's speaking, but it's the Lord. That's the authority. The reason that's important is because later in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul will say, not the Lord, but I. He's now giving his counsel. But in verse 10, he says, it's not me, it's the Lord saying this. What does he say there in verse 10? This is the second thing. That a man should not divorce his wife. You can flip that both ways. There should not be a divorce. Case closed. And if you take that parenthesis, if you move past that parenthesis, he expounds on that same thought in the last half of verse 11. What people focus on is that parenthesis. And they say, well, this is giving me an out. And if I were to divorce, I just don't like them for whatever reason, breaking all the things that I know is right, everything that I've been raised with, then I'll just remain unmarried. Or maybe someday later I'll get over it and we'll get remarried. Whatever. I'll just remain celibate. Verse 11 does not trump verse 10. The fact and the statement of truth is in verse 10. And verse 11 is seen not as this is another option. Verse 11 is seen as but if this happens. If this happens, this is how you handle the situation. What Paul understood about the gravity of this situation, we're talking about marriage and divorce, is the same thing that people understand in today's world. That there may be instances in today's world where two people, one is wholly giving themselves to the other. I'm not going to designate man and wife. But one is totally giving themselves to the other. Or certainly not doing anything to try and destroy the marriage. But the other person, for whatever reason, just doesn't want to be married. And they're gone. And the question that Paul was tackling here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is, what do you tell that person? What do you tell that person who in this instance has lost their spouse? They're gone. What's their commitment to the situation? And what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is, if you can be remarried to that spouse, since that's still your spouse, if you can be remarried, great. If not, you remain celibate. One thing we need to understand about the celibate life, and one thing we need to understand about the single life, there's a difference. The thing we need to understand about the celibate life, it's not a sin to be unmarried. I mean, when I first moved here, you know as well as I know, I was 22. Actually, I was 23 right when I got hired. In a 6-week proving period where Shell had to make sure I wasn't going to go off the rails completely. But when I was 23, I didn't get married. I met Melina until I was 24. You get married until we were 26. I'm doing some really intricate math in my head right now. But there were several time periods in that 1.5, 2-year period where I looked at all my friends, and I think I was a groomsman or a best man or an usher in 6 weddings in that 2-year span. That was tough. That was hard. Because, as the statement goes, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Flip it in this occasion. But you're looking at all these people that are getting married, and you're thinking to yourself, what's wrong with me? And I think it's very easy in situations where the spouse has gone, especially in 1 Corinthians 7, 10, 11 instance, where the spouse is gone, to begin to think to yourself, what's wrong with me? What did I do? Where did I go wrong? And I don't know, maybe there is something. I don't think there is. That's not what I'm talking about right now. I have a whole lot of issues that I won't go into right now. But the overarching theme is that being celibate, being single, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. As a matter of fact, Paul, writing from a position of celibacy, argues that it's actually an advantage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting verse 8, listen to what he says here in this instance. He says, I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. It's great if you remain single. But if not, nothing wrong with being married. He's talking to the celibate, people who have the right to marry. As you go down that passage, starting in verse 25, he expounds on this thought about why it's great. Rephrase that, why it's okay or not a sin to be unmarried. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting verse 25. He says, now concerning virgins I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion. This is where he says, not the Lord, but I. But I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. I think then that it is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be released. By the way, that also trumps verse 11. Don't seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But if you marry, verse 28, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life. I'm trying to spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as they had none. And those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they didn't possess. Verse 31, those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for from the world, the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be free from concern, verse 32. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is unconcerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of this world, how she may please her husband. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. You notice how Paul's opinion is so much more verbose than God's commandment. I thought that was kind of interesting from 1 Corinthians. But what he's saying here in this passage is there's nothing wrong with being married or unmarried, provided that your scriptural situation is fine to both. As a matter of fact, he looks at his own situation and Paul says, I'm unmarried. He can easily look across the aisle and see Peter, who is married. But the whole crux of the situation falls in the idea of what you can do for God as somebody who is unmarried. Now, the specific application of this is talking about that you can travel, you can teach, you can give yourself more fully to the needs of the congregation, to the needs of the gospel. Do whatever you can do. But somebody who's married has responsibilities, and unmarried people don't. And even more so as he uses the phrase in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 of this present distress, the idea of being married and having a family adds more weight to this situation. Because it was not unheard of, and I think this was a very common thing among certain places, it was not unheard of to find a Christian husband. And not knowing that the Christian wife, or maybe they didn't care that the wife was a Christian, the grown adult kids were Christians, whatever the situation is. But it was not unheard of to take the husband and set him in front of his wife and put his wife in a torture position. So where they were hurting her, like maybe the rack, or they were stretching her, or beating her over the head with clubs. And they were saying to the husband, who was a Christian at this point, all you have to do to make this stop is to just renounce Christ. And you're sitting there as a husband, as a father, watching your family be tortured and will very closely be put to death. And you can make it stop like this. All you have to do is denounce Christ. And you know there are a lot of people that There are a lot of people who, because they look at their families who are being tortured, denounce Christ in order that they might save their family. And what Paul is touching on this aspect is the unmarried don't have to deal with it. There's not leverage in that regard to the unmarried people that they can trap, that they can take, and they can torture to extract a denouncement from them. And he says this in this very present distress, which was a very present distress. Despair. When we talk about people that are married, we talk about people that aren't married, it's not a sin to be unmarried. But the whole idea of marriage and divorce or remarriage, if you've been encapsulated into this other aspect, is the idea that if you want to be married, if you can be married, that's the important thing. If you want and can be married, then be married. There's nothing wrong with that. Understand the gravity of the situation. If you want to be unmarried, there's nothing wrong with that either. Both of those situations have very important responsibilities that everybody needs to look out for. Dr. Polemer, I use the right phrase this time, wrote another book. After he had seen the success of 30 Lessons for Living and saw especially that success within the marriage relationship, that was something that people had written letters asking and wanting to know more about, he went on another adventure to ask a bunch of people older than him their advice for marriages, how they could stay married. He saw the themes about investment, he saw the themes about making sure that they stayed committed to it. But he had this to say near the end of it. This was after everything that he had taken, all the advice, in a book called 30 Lessons for Loving. He said the thing of it is, don't love each other for wealth or money. You have to love each other because you love them. You feel it in your heart. You don't care if they get older, if they get sick, or if they get wrinkles. You don't care about anything else, but just for them. You love them. And you don't pretend to love them because of what they give you. You don't pretend to love them because they've got money. You just have to love them because it's somebody that you'd like to spend the rest of your life with. What Dr. Polemer understood was that the central focus in marriage, besides the idea of an investment, is the idea of the self-sacrifice. That you're not in the marriage for what they can give you, but in what you can do for them. And more importantly, what you two can do together. That's the idea of marriage. And that's the reason why in Genesis chapter 2, God looked down at Adam, who was trying to man the entire garden by himself, and said, it's not good for man to be alone. Everybody else has a companion. The man lays down his head at night by himself. He needs a companion. He needs somebody who can not only make him better, but somebody that he can make better. Somebody that he can sink his talents into. Somebody he can grow old with. That's the idea of marriage. When we talk about the Bible's plan for marriage, that's in a nutshell. One man, one woman, growing together, physically and spiritually. We haven't talked this morning about what it takes to become a child of God, but if you're here this morning, you realize that you don't have the relationship with God that you need to. You've sought spiritual help through the hands of the world, or in the arms of something else besides devotion to Him. And this opportunity to turn around and make your life right with God. God is calling, begging, earnestly pleading, not because He wants to make you right under some kind of legal code, that's a part of it, but because He desperately wants you to be right with Him. He loves you so much that He sent His Son to die. If that's not love, I don't know. If we can help you in any way, would you come to Jesus?
God give us Christian homes, homes where the